Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we return to the Middle Ages, when the law was still vague and belief in God's will was stronger than any court. People had a very direct way of determining who was right and who was wrong, letting two people hurl themselves at each other in a life or death 1v1 duel. No referee, no VAR. Whoever lived was right, whoever died was wrong. Simple and swift. And because of that, for many centuries, Europe witnessed countless legendary duels that would leave you speechless when you hear about them. So before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I'm sharing here. And if you're watching this video from a faraway location in an unfamiliar time zone, please let me know your location and local time. Now then, turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let's ease our way into tonight's journey together. When speaking of the most famous duels of medieval Europe, few names surpass Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris, two men who turned a criminal accusation into a life-and-death spectacle before the whole of France. You may be sitting comfortably in your warm blanket, but imagine the atmosphere of winter Paris in 1386. Cold, white breath in the air, and in the duelling ground, two armoured knights preparing for a 1v1 fight that the royal court, the church, and half the country were watching. The story did not begin with galloping horses or clashing steel, but with a shocking accusation. Marguerite de Carouge, Jean's wife, declared that she had been raped by Jacques Le Gris, a powerful nobleman close to the count. In late 14th century Europe, such an accusation was like dropping a spark into a powder keg. Honour, power, religion, and politics all collided in a case no one could guarantee safety in. Jean de Carouge decided, "I will seek justice with the sword," and because people believed at the time that God always stood with the innocent, King Charles X allowed a trial by combat, judgment through a duel, where whoever was still breathing at the end would be deemed the one in the right. A very reasonable method if you were living in 1386. The formal trial took place before the duel, filled with schemes and factions. Le Gris was protected by the most powerful men in Normandy. Jean was seen as hot-headed, uneducated, and always carrying grudges. But what made all of France tremble was not the fight between the two men. It was Marguerite's fate. If her husband lost, she would be burned alive for false accusation, a level of pressure no historical film could ever portray accurately. On 29th of December 1386, the Paris tilt yard became the centre of attention for all of Europe. Two war horses were led out, armour gleaming under the winter sun. You see the crowd packed tightly, holding their breath, not to see who was right or wrong, but to see whom God would choose. A very convenient concept, especially when the legal system was weak and the powerful preferred to avoid responsibility. The trumpet sounded. The two war horses charged straight at each other. At the first clash of lances, neither fell. At the second, wood splintered, metal sparked. One heartbeat later, they threw aside their lances and drew swords. The sound of steel rang out harshly. The stands rose to their feet. Jean appeared slower, older, wearing heavy armour, with a body already worn by many battles. Le Gris was quicker and stronger, considered one of the finest swordsmen in the region. But then, in one exchange, Jean was knocked off his horse, and that was the moment when everyone thought it was over. But fate, or as medieval people would say, God's will, loved dramatic twists. Jean rolled up, pulled out his dagger. The two grappled on the frozen ground, the heavy armour making each movement feel like pushing through mud. Le Gris tried to pin Jean down, and the crowd held its breath. And then, In a moment as fragile as silk, Jean twisted, mustered all his strength, and drove the dagger straight into Legree's neck. Silence. A few screams. Then the arena erupted in cheers. Jean stood up, panting beneath his helmet. Legree lay motionless, blood spreading across the earth. And that was it. God had spoken. Jean won, which meant Marguerite was innocent. Legree died, which meant he was guilty in the eyes of all of France. More than 600 years later, many historians believe Legree may have been innocent. But medieval law did not allow the verdict to be overridden once the loser was dead and the winner was viewed as the one chosen by God. Justice at that time was terrifyingly simple. The outcome of this duel not only determines the fate of 3 people, it became the last legally sanctioned duel in French history. After that, the state began to realise that justice based on swords and shields might be a little difficult to control. A century later, trial by combat gradually disappeared. On the field of Kulikovo, the early morning of 1380 was filled with a biting chill. 2 armies stood facing each other, so silent that one could hear the dew falling on armour and the snorting of horses. Before the actual battle began, both sides prepared for an important ritual, sending out 2 champions to step into the open ground and fight a duel. For medieval people, this was not merely an opening act. It was a way to ask whose side heaven and earth stood on. From the Rus side stepped Peresvet, a monk wearing armour, an image both strange and solemn. He had left his monastery to take up the spear, carrying with him the blessing of St. Sergius. In the ranks, you can imagine the eyes of every soldier watching him ride forward. Calm, quiet, with not a trace of hesitation. Opposite him was Chelubey, a Tatar war champion famed for his horsemanship and mastery of the lance. The battlefield was his natural terrain, and everyone knew he had been chosen as champion, not by chance. The 2 halted, facing each other, exchanging no words. In that moment, the entire plain seemed to hold its breath. Then came the thunder of hooves as both began to charge. You can picture that instant. Earth flying up in dust, lances lowered, strength and will colliding as 2 arrows shot straight toward each other. No testing moves, no probing. On the very first thrust, both were struck. Chelubey fell first, motionless. Peresvet, though mortally wounded, remained upright in his saddle. His horse carried him back towards the Rus lines, and only when it stopped did his body collapse onto the ground. The sight left the Rus soldiers stunned. A monk, not a knight, not a commander, had died while still holding his seat until the very last second. To people of the time, this was a clear sign of divine favour, a message from heaven that the Rus would have a chance of victory, and that belief spread quickly. Among the ranks, warriors who had carried a deep fear of the Mongol Tatar cavalry suddenly felt their hearts ignite. If a monk could bring down the enemy's champion in the first strike, perhaps the entire army could do the same. After that fateful 1v1, the Battle of Kulikovo erupted. It was bloody, exhausting, and lasted many hours. But the Rus spirit was stronger than ever. They charged into the fray as though carrying with them the image of Peresvet sitting unmoving on his horse, a symbol of steadfastness, bravery, and faith. By the end of the day, victory belonged to the Rus. Not easily, not without heavy losses, but it was a victory that marked the beginning of breaking free from the domination of the Golden Horde for centuries to come. The story of Peresvet and Chelubey is recorded in chronicles not just as a duel, but as an omen, a sacred confirmation. Although details may have been embellished over time, the spiritual strength it inspired is undeniable. A 1v1 lasting only a few seconds, yet enough to raise the morale of thousands. A fleeting moment, yet powerful enough to become a symbol of an entire people. And that is what makes the Perisfair versus Chelobey duel one of the most memorable confrontations of the Middle Ages. Not for technique, not for tactical finesse, but for its spiritual meaning, something medieval people considered more important than steel or the edge of the spear. On the Bannockburn Plateau in 1314, amid the dry wind sweeping across dew-covered grass and ground hard as steel, there was a moment that entered history not because it was long, but because it happened so quickly. A moment where, if you had been standing there, you would have blinked once, and very likely missed the very event that decided the spirit of the entire battle. It was when Robert the Bruce, the King of Scotland, whose reputation was only newly forged, confronted Henry de Bohun, a young and proud English knight, nephew of a distinguished earl. De Bohun rode a heavy warhorse, armour gleaming under the afternoon light, a solid, long lance in his hand. The moment he saw Bruce standing slightly apart from the formation, he saw an opportunity to carve his name into history, one direct thrust straight into the heart of the entire Scottish independence movement. And Bruce, he sat on a light horse, wearing no full suit of armour, only a helmet and his familiar battle-axe. In terms of equipment, he looked more like a hunter than a king about to enter a 1v1 with a heavily armoured knight. If you had been standing nearby, you might have wondered, what exactly is the king planning to do? De Bohun saw his target. He lowered his body, levelled his lance and spurred his horse forward. A charge like thunder, stones and dirt flung behind him, mingling with the ringing of armour. The English who were watching from afar surely held their breath, waiting for the moment the King of Scotland would be swept from the battlefield. But Bruce did not panic. He waited. He waited until the very moment when de Bohun's lance could have pierced straight through his chest. Then, beneath the blazing sunlight over the Bannockburn fields, Bruce gently pulled the reins, dodging aside with a movement as neat as slicing through the wind. De Bohun's lance thrust into the empty air very close but not close enough, and in that decisive second Bruce rose from the saddle, swung his battle-axe over his head with all his strength, and brought it down on de Bohun's helmet. The strike was so powerful that the handle of the axe snapped in half, according to historical accounts. And Henry de Bohun? He never got a second chance. His helmet split apart and the English knight fell before his horse had even begun to slow. Can you picture that moment? A heavily armoured English knight charging like a storm brought down by a single blow from a king on a light horse. A true one-shot, so clean and swift that if you told it casually, people might think you were talking about folklore, not an event actually recorded at Bannockburn. But it happened, and its effect reached far beyond the fate of one night. The spirit of the Scottish army erupted. They saw their king, who had once fled, once failed, once lived hidden in the woods for years, now standing firm, holding half the broken axe handle, his back straight as though he had done something utterly ordinary. The entire army seemed to awaken. Warriors exhausted from days of marching suddenly felt stronger, faster, and more confident than an enemy many times their number. The story says Bruce only said one small sentence after the strike: "I am very sorry to have broken my axe." A line perfectly in the style of a Scotsman, cold, simple and slightly ironic about his own victory. Meanwhile the English were shaken. An unofficial 1v1 lasting only a few seconds had shattered the confidence of their large, well-equipped forces holding higher ground. They watched a night of noble blood be dispatched so quickly that they barely understood what had happened. The Battle of Bannockburn then became the greatest victory in Scottish history, solidifying Bruce's position and pushing back English domination for decades. But all of that, the shift in political momentum, the rising confidence of the rebels, and the story of national spirit, was ignited by a single axe blow. Today, historians still debate the exact accuracy of the strike, whether the handle truly broke in half, and whether de Bohun was caught off guard or simply made a tactical mistake. But those details matter less than the truth that one tiny moment, one lightning-fast decision, and one perfectly delivered strike changed the entire morale of the Battle of Bannockburn. In the medieval world, where people believed victory bore the mark of God, Bruce's blow became a message sent straight from heaven onto the battlefield. And from that moment, no one in the Scottish ranks felt inferior any longer. One breath, one dodge, one strike, one knight fallen, and an entire nation rose. If there is a place where the tradition of duelling reached its purest form, no complicated laws, no religious ceremony, no battlefield banners, it is the Viking North. A place where sea wind lashes your face like a whip. The ground is sharp and cold as stone, and a man's honour is sometimes determined by nothing more than a circle of animal hide on the ground. Here, the Vikings had a form of 1v1, both ancient and chilling. Holmgang, not a grand battlefield, not an arena full of spectators, but a space so small that stepping half a foot out of line meant breaking the rules. A piece of hide lay on the ground, sometimes a tiny island, and two people stepping in to settle a dispute in the most literal meaning of the word settle. The reasons leading to a holmgang were countless. A piece of land, a cow, a debt, an insult, or sometimes simply because someone, after too much mead, casually remarked that the other man's sword was dull. In the north, people believed that honour could not be delayed, and certainly could not be touched without an answer. And if words were not enough, the hide would give the verdict for them. The rules were clear. Two people stood inside the circle, weapons of their choice. Sword, axe, shield, and neither could step outside the boundaries of the hide. Just touching the ground beyond meant defeat. If you fell, you lost. If your opponent finished you before you could do anything, you obviously lost. A system so simple it was frightening, because it removed everything except raw survival instinct. Holmgang existed long enough to enter legend, to be carved into the sagas as an inseparable part of life, and among the countless names that stepped onto the hide, none stood out like Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, warrior, and the last person you would ever want to joke with. The sagas tell that Egil took part in a holmgang to keep land, to seek revenge, or simply to prove he was right. In one famous duel, he faced Ljot the Pale over a boundary dispute. The two stepped into the small circle, and shortly after, Ljot lay motionless. Egil won, picked up his property, and walked away with a calmness that sent chills down the spine, as though he had just completed an administrative procedure. The irony lies here. Holmgang was created as a way to reduce community violence. Instead of dragging two families into a generations-long blood feud, two individuals settled things themselves, taking full responsibility. But like every powerful system, it was soon exploited. Skilled warriors could challenge anyone. The weak could not refuse. Honour and property gradually became trophies for the strongest hands. By the 11th century, Iceland had to ban holmgang because too many people were using it to force others to hand over land, gold, or simply for violent entertainment. But even after its ban, the tradition lived on in memory, in the sagas, and in the Viking view of life and death. Sharp, simple, brutally straightforward. When you stand on that hide, in the most Viking sense, the world shrinks to just two people and one question. Who will leave this place on his own legs? No army to support you, no cross to protect you, no tactical advice. Only the cold wind, the tight breath, the scent of animal hide, and the glint of steel. One wrong step, one moment of hesitation, and fate changes course. Holmgang was not entertainment. It was a ritual, a way to assert dignity, settle hatred, and sometimes to let the gods witness whom they favoured. The Vikings believed that victory came not only from skill, but also from divine judgment. And that belief made the Holmgang both brutal and profoundly symbolic. When the hide lay still after the duel, soaked with dark red blood, people believed that the god's decision was complete. All disputes, grudges, insults, everything ended right there at that small boundary. In the medieval world, where honour was worth more than life, Germany was the place where duelling was seen not merely as a tradition, but almost as a science. And everything we know about those 1v1 battles is preserved in full within the strange yet haunting pages of Hans Talhofer, the 15th century master of swordsmanship. Just by opening a random page of his Fechtbücher, you feel as though you've stepped into a stage where justice, religion, law and violence blend into a bizarre ritual, where one person lives, one person dies, and that is considered entirely reasonable. In German society at the time, disputes were not always resolved with words. No, the nobility believed in a brutally simple truth. If both sides swear they are right, then let God decide. And God decided by having them fight in front of everyone. Not fighting for a sport, but fighting by rules, by procedure, by exactly what Talhofer documented: regulated weapons, a constructed arena, overseen by referees, and ending with a body collapsing to the ground. Talhofer's books describe everything: long swords with guard positions like a deadly dance, war axes heavy as a sentence, shields, armour, horses, ropes, and even duels so bizarre that modern readers can only raise an eyebrow. But all of it was real, and what makes them chilling is not the technique but the purpose. This was not a martial arts demonstration. This was a court of law. The loser was not just the loser, they were the guilty one. And the reasons for these duels were endless. Accusations of adultery, land disputes, insults to honour, lying in court, even arguments over whose cow it was. Some duels took place for reasons so trivial that you would think, not worth dying for. But in that society, honour was non-negotiable. A missed thrust could cost a family its land. A successful blow could preserve a lineage's inheritance. Every duel was a wager no one wanted to abandon. Among the illustrations of steel-soaked combat, there was something even stranger. Duels between husband and wife, recorded clearly and honestly to the point where you wonder whether medieval Germany was overly strict or Talhofer was simply too truthful. According to the rules, the husband, being stronger, had to stand in a pit up to his waist holding a short club. The wife, more agile, stood on the ground holding a stone wrapped in a cloth. There was nothing symbolic about this. They genuinely fought until one yielded or could no longer stand. A bizarre rule, but to society back then, turning marriage into a final boss battle was entirely legal. The clang of steel on steel, the shouting, the heavy breaths, all echoed in the scenes Talhofer described with emotionless strokes, as though he were writing down a cooking recipe. But it is precisely this coldness that lets readers understand the gravity of those duels. This was not entertainment for the wealthy. This was judicial procedure, one of the most serious institutions of medieval Germany. A victory could erase an accusation. A defeat could result in a family's property being confiscated, or their name being shunned by society. And thanks to Talhofer, the modern world knows how serious, complex and terrifying those 1v1 battles truly were. In a society where words were not enough to prove the truth, the sword, the shield and the final blow were the evidence. Reading those pages, you realise there was no other place in history where law, religion, honour and death intertwined as distinctly as in medieval Germany. Just one mistake, one misstep on the fighting mat, and everything, justice, honour, even the fate of an entire family would belong to the person still standing in the dim light of the courtroom. Among the countless strange rituals of medieval Europe, there is one that makes modern historians put the book down and ask, were they actually serious? And the answer, sadly, is yes. If you ever thought medieval marriage revolved only around church, vows and a bit of feudal romance, then 13th, 15th century Germany will wake you right up. There, husbands and wives could settle their disputes, with a public 1v1 duel, fully regulated, fully armed, and overseen by a referee. These husband-wife duels were not legends or folk jokes. They appear in the illustrations of Hans Talhofer, the 15th century fencing master, who documented them with such frightening detail that you could recreate the battlefield in your own living room. No one knows whether he recorded them out of curiosity or because the law required it. But Talhofer was certainly not joking. These fights were real, accepted by local judicial systems, and even had clearly defined standing positions. The structure of the duel was so bizarre that only the Middle Ages could have invented it. The husband, representing superior strength, had to stand in a pit dug to waist height, immobilized from the waist down. The wife, considered the weaker one, stood on the ground, free to move, holding a stone wrapped in a cloth like a crude flail. The husband was given a long club, but being stuck in the pit meant that turning, dodging or counter-attacking was extremely difficult. Sounds like a prank. No, this was official law. The Germans of the time believed in a natural balance of justice. Men were stronger, so they must be restricted from the duel to be fair. Women were weaker, so they were allowed to use heavier weapons. And thus the two of them, instead of talking things out, had to beat each other with wood and stone in front of the judge. Legal texts from the 13th to 14th centuries describe the details. The husband may use his club to push or strike. The wife may swing or throw the stone, hitting him wherever she can. If the husband climbs out of the pit, it counts as breaking the rules, and he loses. If the wife falls into the pit, the duel stops, and she is considered defeated. All of this took place under the eyes of the community, sometimes with children watching for entertainment, a disturbing aspect. These duels were not meant for fun, but were part of the judicial duel system. In cases where the wife accused the husband of abuse, or the husband accused the wife of adultery, either party could request combat to prove who was telling the truth. Whoever won was right, whoever lost was wrong and had to face punishment accordingly. This created an ironically twisted paradox. A society that declared women weak and in need of protection, but then gave them the right to smash their husbands with a rock in front of everyone. According to some records, there were duels where the wife won because she dodged well and struck the husband on the shoulder so hard he could not continue. There were also cases where the husband simply threw his club at the right moment, causing the wife to lose her balance and fall into the pit. The line between justice and a very bad afternoon was as thin as a medieval piece of linen. And as strange as they sound, these duels reflect the medieval mindset perfectly. The belief that God would stand with the innocent, the idea that honour must be fought for, the absence of rational legal processes, and a world where violence was considered a valid answer to most problems. You can see all of that in Talhofer's illustrations. The husband covered in mud, trapped in a pit. The wife charging forward with a decisive swing. Spectators standing around watching seriously as though this were a normal legal hearing. There is no mockery in his drawings, and that is what chills us. They truly believed this was proper and just, and strangely enough, these husband-wife duels reveal a unique piece of medieval society. Women were bound by hundreds of restrictions, yet in the moment they stepped onto the fighting ground, they had a kind of power that even modern legal systems sometimes fail to give, the literal power of self-defense against abuse, injustice, or false accusations. Still, these duels cannot be romanticized. They were brutal, dangerous, and often ended in blood. No one knows how many were seriously injured or killed, because records usually only note lost or won, rarely what happened afterwards. But history records enough to know this. In medieval Germany, marriage did not only mean until death do us part, sometimes death. Arrived earlier than expected, right in the backyard with a stone and a wooden club. Among the treasury of strange contests in medieval Europe, there is one event that stands apart, shining somewhere between madness and the kind of splendour that only the 14th century could produce. The Combat of the 30, a duel which contemporaries described as an expanded duel, while modern historians often joke that it was the moment people decided that if one-on-one isn't enough, then let's make it 30 on 30 to make it fair. In 1351, in the midst of the War of the Breton Succession, a prolonged conflict between England and France, someone suddenly came up with a very medieval solution for peace. Each side would choose 30 knights, meet at a predetermined place, and fight until one team could no longer continue. No negotiations, no councils, no treaties. Only steel clashing against steel, neighing horses, bloodshed, and honour. The story began with a small dispute between two fortresses. Josselin, belonging to the French Breton side, and Ploermel, held by English mercenaries. The commanders of both sides, Jean de Beaumanoir and Robert Bembro, were men who preferred using swords over using words. Instead of calling each other to a large battle, costly in men and money, they agreed, "We shall fight according to knightly honour. My 30 men, your 30 men. Whoever wins, wins the region." A problem-solving mindset that suited the period perfectly. And so, on a midday of March, on the field between the two fortresses, 60 of the finest warriors were chosen. All wore full armour, all rode war horses, all knew that this fight allowed no half measures, either live in glory or die in legend. Even so, what made the combat of the 30 more unique than any other duel was not the number, but the spirit of idealized chivalry that they deliberately displayed. These men stepped into the fight not because of personal hatred, but because they believed they were defending the honour of their side. That is why the chronicles recorded it in great detail. The The people of the time saw it not as a chaotic skirmish, but as a ritual of combat. The fight took place in a rotating duel format. Both sides lined up, charged at each other on horseback, and when one pair fell, another stepped forward. And naturally, chaos happened faster than anyone expected. Spear thrusts brought down horses, the clash of steel against shields made the field tremble. Wounded knights were pulled to the rear, changed weapons, drank water, then returned to the battlefield. It resembled a brutal version of a tournament where each turn was paid for in blood. There is a famous moment from this fight that chronicles always mention. When Jean de Beaumanoir, the commander of the Breton side, was severely wounded, losing so much blood that he collapsed, a knight from his team said, "Drink some water, sir, you are dying." Beaumanoir, exhausted to the point of collapse but still trying to maintain his bearing, replied with the one sentence that made him an icon of bravery. "Water! I need more blood," a sentence that writers of the time elevated into a symbol of chivalric spirit, death rather than giving up. The English side reacted quickly, fighting with extreme ferocity. Robert Bembra led from the front, personally entering the danger zone to keep the rhythm of the battle. But as the fight dragged on, armour grew heavy on their shoulders, breath became laboured, vision narrowed. It became increasingly clear that this was not a quick, decisive contest, but a battle of attrition. Weapons broke, horses died, armour chipped, and roars echoed whenever a knight was knocked out. The turning point came when Beaumanoir called in two of his infantrymen, men who did not wear heavy armour like knights, but who had better stamina, to support. They used war clubs and light axes to strike into the gaps of armour, taking advantage of the English side's exhaustion. From that moment, the battle gradually shifted. After many hours of fighting, the Breton side won. At least 9 English knights were killed, and many others seriously wounded. Bembra also died, becoming a tragic symbol for his own side. The event is recorded in at least 4 contemporary chronicles, including the Chronique de Froissart, making the combat of the 31 of the most detailed duels described in the Middle Ages. And surprisingly, both sides used this fight as propaganda material. Brittany claimed that the victory proved their righteousness. The English praised Bembra's willingness to fight to the death. History sometimes works that way. A single battle, but each side perceives victory through its own lens. But what makes the combat of the 30 most memorable is its deeper meaning. The first and almost only time in medieval history that a war was condensed into a 30 versus 30 match in the true spirit of the traditional duel. Honour, justice, religious conviction, and the brutal beauty of combat. There was no other fight like it. Neither a full-scale battle nor an individual duel. It stood between two worlds, a ritual of violence marking a period when Europe still believed that justice could be embodied by a single strike of the blade. And when the sun set on the field of Ploermel that day, the survivors returned to the fortress, armour scratched, breath still tasting of iron, but hearts full of pride. Because in the eyes of medieval people, they had just witnessed something one might not see in an entire lifetime. A fight where the honour of an entire region was decided within a circle of 30 men. No more, no less. In the world of medieval knights, honour was not just a vague concept people hung on the wall. It was worth more than gold, more than land, even more than life itself. And because of that, sometimes a single careless remark in a castle's great hall, a mocking comment, a sideways glance, An offhand remark about someone's riding skills or about someone arriving late to a previous battle was enough to ignite a deadly duel. Medieval justice operated on a very simple principle. If honour is wounded, draw your sword. The tradition of honour duels spread across Europe like a kind of superstition, yet it was cherished by the highest ranks of society. In France, knights saw duels as an indispensable part of court life, a way to wash away disgrace. In Italy, where the city-states were always simmering, duels sometimes took place right on the streets of Florence or Milan, between the sound of church bells and curious crowds. In Germany, fight books, such as Talhoffer's, described in great detail each stance, each attack posture in honour duels, as if insulting someone were an event as serious as breaking into the royal treasury. And in England, knights often chose empty patches of ground near castles to fight, where the wind blew cold, armour clinked, and death could come simply because someone was insulted during dinner. Honour duels often began from something extremely small. One knight accusing another of not being courageous enough in a previous battle. Someone saying that another's armour was too clean, meaning he had avoided fighting, or worse, someone hinting that the other's family lineage was not as noble as claimed. Matters like this today would take a few minutes of discussion or a text message apology, but in the 13th, 15th centuries they were settled by two people putting on armour, taking up longswords, and letting fate decide. Contemporary accounts were not exaggerating when they wrote that many knights died because of a single sentence. In a famous incident in France, the knight Jacques de l'Aigle was accused of cowardice in a previous battle. He became so furious that he issued a challenge right in the palace courtyard. The duel happened so quickly that many had not yet understood what was happening when Jacques had already thrust his blade through his opponent's armour, and thus justice was carried out in the way that God, according to the beliefs of the time, surely must have witnessed from above. In Italy, where honour was often as sensitive as a pile of gunpowder, many honour duels began because two knights argued over who should stand closer to the duke, or because a compliment to a woman was considered too familiar by someone else. Those duels sometimes had an artistic air, swords flashing in candlelight, cloaks fluttering, spectators silent. But with a single missed thrust, a single mistimed turn, blood would spill onto the stone pavement. Florence and Siena were famous for duels taking place right in the streets, giving villagers something to gossip about for years. In Germany, honour duels were even codified into formal procedures. Both sides had to announce the cause of the insult, choose weapons, and have witnesses. Sometimes a duel did not end in death, but with one person surrendering. But that was rare, because surrender meant honour was burned to ashes forever. Some knights preferred death to that, and they indeed died. In England, one of the strangest stories concerns the Knight Henry of Essex, who was accused of cowardice for dropping the royal standard during battle. That crime was so severe that it was almost considered treason, and so he was challenged. The duel took place before the royal court, and Henry lost. He was dragged from the field, believed to be dead, but he later survived miraculously and decided to become a monk to avoid being pursued further. In the eyes of contemporaries, his defeat was clear proof that God had taken his opponent's side. Justice at the time was very tidy, sometimes so tidy it was chilling. What is interesting, and also deeply ironic, is that many honour duels were entirely unnecessary. Some happened because a knight said that the feast that night was dull, and the cook, of noble lineage, felt insulted. Or sometimes rumours spread too fast. Someone whispered that a certain knight looked frightened before battle, and then the two had to fight to prove that. The expression was merely caused by the wind blowing into his eyes. But behind all that noise lies an important truth. Honor duels were the true reflection of the knightly spirit of the age. In a society where honor was more valuable than life, where people believed their destiny lay in God's hands and the sword was merely the instrument through which God delivered judgment, a duel was the only way to resolve the conflict between wounded pride and collective law. Today, looking back, it is hard to believe that men wearing armor weighing dozens of kilograms hurled themselves at each other because of a single sentence. But to them, it was inevitable, and that very fact created one of the most distinctive chapters in European history. Duels whose consequences did not end at a scar, but sometimes changed an entire life, or ended it. In the medieval world, where honour could weigh more than land taxes and arrogance rose higher than a church bell tower, sometimes a 1v1 duel had the power to change the entire political map. It sounds strange, because today, power struggles usually take place in closed meeting rooms, with paperwork, legal systems, and cold handshakes. But more than 600 years ago, if two lords were fighting over territory or authority, they sometimes didn't want to drag thousands of innocent peasants into war. And so they chose a simpler approach, a solo duel. Medieval people had a strong belief in God's judgment. Therefore, if two lords confronted each other, one would say, "If I am right, God will let me win." The other would reply, "Then let us see whom God favours more." And so a political duel was set, not for entertainment, but to decide territorial claims, the future of families, and even the peace of an entire region. Some treaties of the time clearly stated a champion combat clause, meaning each side would choose its strongest representative to fight. If the representative won, their lord was considered to have been granted the rightful claim by God. The interesting part is this. The representative could be anyone, an experienced knight, a powerful bodyguard, or sometimes the lord himself would step into battle. And when that happened, the 1v1 fight was no longer just about settling a dispute, but an event capable of transferring land ownership on that very afternoon. One of the most famous accounts took place in the 11th century between Lord Guy of Ponty and his rival, who were disputing control of a coastal region in northern France. Their conflict reached the edge of war, but instead of exhausting their forces and letting villages suffer pillaging, they chose the proud yet efficient method, a representative duel. The winner would keep the land, the loser would have to accept fate, losing the territory, losing his life, or sometimes both. This made the duel a rather medieval form of diplomatic negotiation. No paperwork, no lawyers, just steel and blood. Another example comes from 12th century Sicily under King Roger II. A Norman knight was accused of rebellion, and to avoid triggering a civil war, the king allowed a political duel. Either win to prove his loyalty, or lose and let God reveal the truth. That knight fought, lost, and was immediately convicted of treason. For medieval people, the duel spoke for itself. Interestingly, many political duels did not happen for lofty reasons like preventing war. Sometimes the lords simply wanted to display their strength, a way to send a message to enemies and subjects that, "I am strong enough not to need an army." Throughout the 13th to 14th century Europe, this was a common psychological tactic. If a lord boldly stepped before a crowd, sword in hand, facing a challenger himself, his reputation could rise faster than a 6-month military campaign. But the downside of such recklessness was significant. If he lost, a lord would not only lose honour, he would often lose his territory to his opponent. and thus a piece of land, a fortress or a hunting forest could change ownership after only a few minutes of clashing blades. History records many such cases, especially in Germany and Burgundy, where lords were notoriously hot-tempered and preferred proving themselves through violence rather than paperwork. Another notable case occurred in Switzerland during the early Swiss Confederation, when a Habsburg lord challenged a local leader over taxation rights in the Uri Valley. The duel took place in front of the villagers, and when the Habsburg lord lost, a humiliating defeat, control of the valley slipped away from him, helping fuel the anti-Habsburg movement. One thrust might not kill a dynasty immediately, but it could create a significant crack in the political landscape. The irony lies in this. Although these duels were considered alternatives to war, they were still drenched in violence and blood. They were not as beautiful as the old paintings showing knights gleaming under the sun. They were brutal, smelling of iron and rust, and often ended with the final groan of a man whose fate and whose lands had been tied to the weapon in his hand. Yet to medieval people, all of this made perfect sense, because God, they believed, was watching and deciding. That fervent belief made political duels a distinctive part of European history. They existed at the intersection of warfare, law, and superstition. They were a way for people to entrust the fate of their lands to divine will, as if everything, from harvests to political power, belonged to an invisible guiding hand. From the modern perspective, it is hard to believe that the future of an entire region could depend on the strength of two men standing in the middle of a battlefield. But it happened many times, and those duels created one of the most intriguing corners of the medieval world, where a one-on-one fight did not just decide who lived or died, but sometimes decided who ruled, who lost power, and who would be remembered in the pages of history. When we look back at the entire 1v1 tradition of medieval Europe, we notice something interesting. Those duels were never simply about two people charging at each other with swords, axes, or lances to see who was stronger. Behind the sound of clashing metal lay an entire system of beliefs, laws, honour and politics interwoven so tightly that today it is almost hard to believe such a thing ever existed. Yet for many centuries Europeans entrusted their fate, sometimes even the fate of a kingdom, to the blade of two men standing before each other, believing that God would choose who was right and who was wrong with a single thrust. In the early Middle Ages, trial by combat was not a rare option. It was the method used to settle difficult lawsuits when testimonies were unclear, evidence scarce, and justice relied heavily on your faith. Instead of arguing before a judge, both sides would choose their weapons, step into an arena, and fight. Whoever won was believed to have been granted divine confirmation of their truth, a legal mechanism that was simple, efficient, and naturally, potentially deadly. For this reason, codes such as the ordeal or the judicial duel not only existed but were held in high regard. France, Germany, and England each had clear regulations on how to organize a lawful duel, from choosing weapons, clothing, and locations, to determining who was allowed to stand near the field. Everything was meticulously recorded. Many documents also emphasize that winning by cunning still counted as winning, since God was believed never to let a deceitful person triumph, unless that was his deeper will. A very medieval kind of logic. Everything is correct if it is believed to be correct. Moving into the late Middle Ages, trial by combat gradually gave way to a more refined, yet equally dangerous form, the duel of honour. As legal systems modernized and the Church began opposing the use of violence for judicial purposes, knights found another reason to fight: pride. A single rude remark, an insulting glance, or an accusation of cowardice was enough for two men to arrange a meeting at the edge of a forest, bring swords and witnesses, and fight until someone fell. In many cases, these duels were no longer recognized by the state, but were still regarded by the nobility as an indispensable ritual. For them, honor mattered no less than life. Books from the time recorded stories so absurd that even today they seem unbelievable. Two Italian knights arranged a duel because they argued over the colour of a cloak. A French nobleman demanded a fight to the death because he had not been seated near the dining table. And many died simply because someone whispered that they looked a bit weak. But although the reasons sound irrational, they reveal clearly the mindset of society at the time. Honour was tied to power, and power was tied to politics. To defend honour was to defend one's status before the court and the populace. Then in the post-medieval period, as firearms appeared and warfare changed, duels no longer played a decisive role in law or politics. But they did not disappear. They evolved, becoming an art, then from art into sport. The combat techniques recorded by masters like Hans Talhofer or Fiore de' Liberi were transformed into training routines, fencing lessons, and refined systems of swordsmanship. From that, modern fencing was born. Today, if you step into a fencing hall and watch athletes in white armour and steel masks touch swords with the cry of "touché," it is hard to imagine that the origin of all these things was once a fight in which losing meant death. A thrust today earns a point, not a verdict. A touch is recognised by a referee, not considered evidence of God's will. And yet the legacy of medieval 1v1 combat still carries a special weight. It is not just a story of violence, it is the story of an era that believed truth could be determined by blood. That honour had to be defended by one's own hands. That politics could sometimes be decided by two individuals instead of two armies. For that reason, every 1v1 duel in European history is both wild and solemn, barbaric and glorious, a strange mixture that could only exist in the Middle Ages. Today, looking back, we may laugh at the absurdity of the reasons that led to duels. We may shiver when reading descriptions of combat, or wonder why people saw violence as justice. But regardless of what we think, we cannot deny that those 1v1 fights left a deep mark on European history, a legacy not only of force, but of belief, law, and the people who lived in a time when everything could be decided in the blink of a blade. And finally, as we close this bloody yet meaningful chapter of history, one conclusion always echoes. Nowhere but medieval Europe could the fate of a single person, and sometimes an entire kingdom, be determined by a duel. And now, gently drift into sleep. Sleep well, my dear friends.